Hi guys, we're picking up today with chapter 34, which is actually our second to last chapter, so we're almost done with navigating early. We arrived back at Morton Hill on Saturday to a strange mix of reprimands and cheers, the reprimands coming from teachers and the cheers coming mostly from boys who appeared equally awed and envious. Earlier in the week, the weather at sea had cleared enough to allow my dad to arrive on campus on the Wednesday of fall break, which left plenty of time for Early and me to be declared missing. Apparently, our absence had caused quite a stir, and there were lots of folks out looking for us. But when my dad laid eyes on me, he didn't seem mad. He just hugged me for a long time. I think he didn't want to let go because he was crying. The next day, Dad drove Early and me north into the woods of Maine. Of course, there was no way to know if we would find Fisher, but we figured the best place to start was at the logging camp. And there he was, chopping wood in the chill, misty air as the sky clouded over and threatened rain. Early and I got out of the jeep, but hung back. Fisher stood up straight at the sight of a naval captain approaching and saluted. It was admirable, but sad, too. He was so thin, and his saluting hand trembled. Dad saluted back. "At ease, son." Fisher's shoulders relaxed. The two of them sat on a couple of stumps and leaned toward one another in a quiet conversation. I heard only bits and pieces, but, judging from the way each listened and responded, I knew that these two men, these soldiers, were speaking a language that they both understood, one of duty, honor, and loss. Eventually, I learned that Fisher had been wounded by debris from the bridge explosion, and after nearly drowning in the Allier River, he was found by a French farmer and taken to his home to recuperate. While there, he learned that the army had commissioned 8 markers to be placed in the town square to commemorate the 8 fallen soldiers. They thought that he had died along with his men. By then, the war was drawing to a close. He had suffered a great trauma and couldn't bear the thought of suddenly reappearing and being hailed as a hero for having destroyed the bridge and enemy tank when his fellow soldiers had died in the mission. But mostly, he couldn't bear the fact that he'd been absent from the shed when his friends were killed. "I should have been there with them," he'd said. I remembered Early saying that no one knew where Mozart was buried, that maybe he'd wanted it that way, to be unencumbered by praise and accolades. Fisher wanted it that way too, but while he was still alive. So he wandered alone through France and England, then hopped aboard a cargo ship and made his way back to Maine. The army had declared him dead, and in that he found his only comfort, and the woods of Maine were his resting place. After some time, Fisher and Dad stood, and my father placed his hand firmly on Fisher's shoulder. "You've had a tough go of it, Lieutenant," my dad said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes, sir." "You had a mission and you carried it out to the best of your ability." "Yes, sir." "And a lot of good men were lost." "Yes, sir." "I've known good men like that, and I can tell you, as bad as that loss is, the only thing that makes it worse is losing another one. Your mission is over, son. It's time to come home." There was a long pause. Fisher looked up, letting the wind breathe a cool sigh through his shaggy hair, and the authority in my dad's words seemed to settle him like a warm bath on a cold day. His tears mingled with the first drops of rain. "Yes, sir." We headed toward the jeep, and I found myself marveling at my dad, at the ease he had in communicating with Fisher. But I think I also felt a tinge of envy, and wondered if my father and I would ever have that same ease and understanding. My dad looked up, letting the raindrops touch his face. Maybe he had a few tears he was trying to hide. After a moment, he looked at me and said, We'd better get a move on before the rain washes all the dry off." I smiled at the phrase. It was my mother's. Hers was a language my dad and I could both understand. Fisher looked better with his beard shaved and hair cut, but he was still weak and shaky and very malnourished. We took him to the hospital in town, where he would get a lot of rest and eat 3 squares a day. Early and I visited every day after school, sneaking in maple fudge and assorted jelly beans to round out his 3 squares. A few days later, Dad drove us, Early and me, to Boston for the culmination of the Fall Math Institute. Fisher couldn't go, but he told Early to give that numbskull mathematician the what for. The sun streamed into the great oak-paneled lecture hall, where we sat quietly, watching as Professor Douglas Stanton wrote out more than 200 digits which, he explained, were the most recently calculated numbers of pi. He talked long and loud and wrote lots of symbols and equations on the chalkboard, highlighting the fact that there were no ones in the most recently calculated digits of pi. He explained that, based on this disappearance of the number 1, he'd concluded that other numbers would also disappear, and that pi would eventually end. When he finished, there was a great deal of fuss and applause, and Professor Stanton raised his bushy eyebrows and said he would entertain questions or rebuttals if anyone was so inclined. Early was inclined. He stood up, all 4 feet 7 inches of him, and walked to the chalkboard. Without saying a word, he began making markings of his own, crossing out some of Dr. Stanton's figures. Then, with his little piece of chalk, he drew a vertical line, one after the other, after one number in the series, and then drew a horizontal line through the remaining numbers, replacing them with a new series of numbers that actually began with and included the number 1. The entire audience sat in stunned silence. I can't even pretend to explain the notations he made, but there were a few gasps, and a steady murmur spread throughout the room. Judging from the reaction, I assumed Early had just delivered a devastating blow to Professor Stanton's theory. But Early wasn't done. He turned to face the auditorium and spoke without the use of a microphone. He didn't need it, as his voice was already loud and the room was pin-drop quiet. "Proof by contradiction," he said. "Professor Stanton says there are no more 1s in the number. Unfortunately, his numbers are wrong. The 1 did disappear for a while, but Professor Stanton didn't know that pi was just lost. He was sad and had a big hole in his heart. He'd lost so much and didn't have his mother or father or any friends. He just needed more time in the empty space. Until," Early pointed to the sequence of numbers that had made the crowd gasp, "someone would find him." And now here we are with Early telling the last story of Pi. Finding Pi. For a long time, Pi lay hurt and alone, drifting between life and death. His thoughts meandered from memory to dream. His hands, his arms, and his whole body were so translucent that he was certain he could no longer be counted among the living, until he heard a sound. It was a voice, hoarse and raspy. "Is someone there?" Pi sat up, or thought he did, although he could barely feel the rock beneath him. His head ached where he'd cracked it. He touched the trickle of blood that made its way down his scalp. If he could feel his headache and his blood still trickled, then he must be alive, he reasoned. "Hello?" he croaked. "I'm here." A shadowy figure peered over the ledge above him, another tortured soul whose burdens had led him to this place. "Take my hand," the voice said. Pi got to his feet and thrust the pack up and out of the hole. It landed with a thud. He reached for a rock jutting out above his head, then found a foothold and hoisted himself up a few inches. He searched for another rock and another foothold. Finally, he was able to grab hold of the hand that reached for him. The hand was firm and strong and pulled him out of the hole. Pi had many questions to ask. "What are you doing in this desolate place? Can you really see me? Am I still alive?" But before he could speak, he gazed into the face of the one whose hand he still held. Pi stared, dumbfounded. "Father?" The man looked equally surprised and held his son in a long embrace. "Pi," he answered in a whisper. Standing in his father's arms, something shifted in Pi. He took in what seemed like his first real breath in a very long time. The air around him felt different on his skin. Pi wasn't sure if he earned the name Polaris or not, but it no longer mattered. He had longed to hear the name his mother called him, Pi. Words flowed out, and Pi learned that his father had been hunting when their village was attacked. He returned to find such devastation that he'd wanted to leave along with the other survivors. But he stayed for many months, waiting for his only son to return. His son did not come back. Heartbroken, he felt that his burden was too great to bear, and he, like Pi, was drawn to the place of lost souls. Now that father and son had been reunited, they needed to find their way out of the winding catacombs. But how? It was dark, and they'd been wandering the maze in tunnels and caves for so long. Then Pi saw the drawings on the rock wall. The drawings were simple and moved from one cave to the next, telling the story of an ancient people on a journey. The people in the story followed the sun until it grew dark. Then, in another room, the drawings showed them following the stars until finally there was a bear, a great black bear, shown leading her cubs. The people followed her, and so did Pi and his father. As they walked, the air gradually got cooler and sweeter. The whispers and sighs faded away, and eventually the light of day replaced the darkness. Pi and his father passed through a misty waterfall and found themselves on dry ground. Both of them took a moment to breathe in the fresh air and warm their faces in the sunlight. Pi's hands were no longer translucent. They were flesh and blood. So that was chapter 34, and next time we will pick up with our very last chapter. I'll see you guys later.